woman ahead of her time. She was a woman ahead of her time. Despite her impressive lineage and affluent upbringing, she decided as a young woman that traditional domestic life wasn't really her calling, and she instead dedicated her life to mission work abroad. And in 1835, she was actually the first unmarried female missionary that the Protestant Episcopal Church sent to a foreign land. She was born 211 years ago today. She was born on May 20th, 1811 at Belle Grove Plantation, but her family's home was actually a place called Cedar Grove, which was and still is to this day across the field from Belle Grove. I created a family tree of Mary's parents and grandparents because everybody has the same name, and I found myself getting confused. I was hoping that this would help break it down. So her mother was Eleanor. She went by Nelly Conway Hite Baldwin. Nelly's parents were Major Isaac Hite Jr. and Eleanor Nelly Madison Hite. Major Hite and Eleanor and Nelly Hite were actually the ones who built the manor home at Belle Grove. They broke ground in 1794 and ultimately finished construction in 1797. And a little trivia nugget for you. Mary was actually the grandniece of James Madison. His sister was Mary's maternal grandmother, Nelly Hite. Again, it's confusing. Everybody has the same name, but she was his grandniece. Mary's dad was Dr. Cornelius Elijah Baldwin. His dad was Cornelius Baldwin, and his mom was Mary Briscoe Baldwin. Mary was actually the second oldest of 6 children. I was able to find 3 images, 3 photographs, including Mary. This is actually her youngest brother, Robert Stewart Baldwin. And we also have a photograph of her youngest sister, Anne Mary Baldwin Hay. And I'll show that in just a few slides. All her life and all growing up, Mary was known as kind, patient, and thoughtful. And this was particularly evident after the loss of her parents. She was no stranger to grief. She lost both of her parents within just a couple of years of each other. Her father died in 1828 and her mother in 1830. And it actually, after her mother Nellie died, Mary and her eldest sister Eleanor took care of their younger siblings for about a year with the help of their maternal grandparents. Major Hite, and by this point, his new wife, Anne Tunstall Murray Hite, whose photograph you see here, this was taken in 1851, just before she passed away at 68 years old. As a sidebar, for those of you new to Belle Grove's history, Major Hite lost his first wife, Nellie, in 1802, and he remarried Anne the following year in 1803. We actually have another exhibit on Virtual Belle Grove that's all about Anne. If you haven't had a chance to look it out, I hope you do. Mary's exhibit online delves into this relationship a bit more, but I do want to mention that Mary was very close to Anne Hite. It was really, in a lot of ways, they were bonded through their deep religious devotion, and they kept in touch with each other. Even as Mary traveled abroad, they remained very close. So after about a year of taking care of her younger siblings, Mary and Eleanor needed a break. So their younger brothers went on to public school. Their youngest sister, Anne, went to live with the maternal grandparents at Belle Grove with Major Hite and Anne Hite. And Mary and Eleanor took a break. They went to Staunton, Virginia to stay with family. At this point, Mary was only about 20 years old. And like so many young people, she was figuring out her life. She wasn't really sure what she wanted to do. She felt that God had given her talents that she wanted to use for a greater good, a greater purpose. She just didn't really know what that was going to look like. During this time, to sort of set the stage for the greater historical context, there was a growing sense of empowerment among Christian women through foreign mission work. And this time was also marked with a growing awareness of the power associated with educating women. The benefits were far-reaching. She had a lot going on at this time. She was thinking through a lot. She obviously had lost her parents. She stepped into being a caretaker at a fairly young age. And she was also struggling with religion, which was one more thing for her to be contending with. The image you see here is actually of Bishop William Meade. He was a mentor to Mary. He was Bishop William Meade of the Diocese of Virginia. She talked with and confided in him a lot during this time where she was trying to figure out her way. And this mentorship ended up resulting in a lifelong commitment to God, at which point Mary figured out that she wanted to be engaged in some sort of Christian work, but she still, as a woman, knew that she wasn't going to be able to likely enter the ministry. She thought about missionary work, but even that at the time seemed pretty unattainable for her. Instead, she was a student. She was an eternal student. And she thought, well, that's it. I'll teach. Like, that's the perfect balance. She thought that she would travel to rural parts of the country, build these schools, and have religion be the foundation. It would kind of give her the best of both worlds. So she began to tell her family and friends about her goals of finishing her education, which had gotten derailed a bit after the death of her parents, again, being a caretaker. Folks were pretty critical of her. They were judgmental by this point. And one of the things I want to mention is how unfazed she seemed. She was so passionate. Her conviction is incredibly admirable. And it's one of the things, there were a few qualities that really stood out during my research, and her conviction is one of them. She was so passionate about her calling and so dedicated to God's work that no one's opinion stood in her way. She had this vision and she had the strength to follow through despite criticism and judgment and skepticism. Everybody has a peanut gallery, and Mary was not immune from that. So she stayed with her aunt in Staunton, and during this time she decided to go back to school. So she went to a boarding school for a couple of years, and she ultimately became an assistant teacher while she was finishing her studies. And by becoming an assistant teacher, she was able to sort of get hands-on training on how to become a teacher and make sure that it was something she really wanted to do while simultaneously finishing her studies. Around the same time she was teaching at the boarding school, the Protestant Episcopal Society was looking for a woman to go to Athens, Greece, to help a woman named Mrs. Hill, who had started a missionary school or mission school with her husband, Dr. Hill, in Athens, Greece. Mary saw this opportunity to travel to Greece as a calling directly from God, but it's not like she jumped at the opportunity right away. She thought through everything very thoroughly. There are a lot of letters from her at the time where she deliberated, and she essentially drafted a pro-con list, trying to make sure that this was something that was the right fit for her. She wasn't hasty about anything she did in life. And she thought, this is too good of an opportunity. I'm going to go for it. So she went to Athens. In 1835, I want to set the stage real quickly of Greece around this time. The country had just become an independent state in 1830, at which point the government provided elementary education for all young children at a low fee, assuming their parents could pay for it. Greece had always encouraged learning and respected domestic life, and they actually required that all children aged 7 to 12 attend school. Before they'd gained their independence, the Greeks had actually been subjected to all sorts of injustices. So when the missionaries arrived, they weren't just providing spiritual guidance, they were also providing physical guidance. So Mary comes in 1835 and she hits the ground running. The mission school that she was a part of wasn't just teaching scripture, they were actually teaching these young female students how to sew and knit. And the goal was to teach them how to become seamstresses so that they would not only learn Christianity, but they would also have an actual marketable skill where they could provide for their families. Another little trivia nugget in case you see it on a crossword puzzle: sewing schools were actually called Lancasterian schools or schools of industry. As when Mary was growing up, everyone in Athens loved her. There was a lot of admiration for her. In the Greek community in which she lived, they loved the way that she was teaching these young girls how to not only learn how to read and write, but also be independent. And the admiration and respect was very much mutual. On teaching the girls, Mary is actually quoted as saying, "The Greeks of today truly seek knowledge, and they're not slow to acquire it, I assure you." So there really was mutual admiration on both sides. She was happy to be there. But grief struck again, loss struck again. In 1847, Mary's youngest sister, Anne Hay, lost her husband, and it left Anne a widow to their baby boy, John Hay. And at the same time, Mary lost her eldest sister, Eleanor. Eleanor was already a widow, so when Eleanor died, she left behind three orphan children, who actually, after she passed away, Mary was in charge, was left to take care of these three orphan children. So not only was Mary dealing with the grief, the loss of her eldest sister, but she was trying to figure out, how am I going to take care of these three kids? I'm in Athens. My family is back in Virginia. And I put her in a pretty precarious spot. She didn't want to turn her back on her family, but she also didn't want to turn her back on these students who had become a pretty integral part of her life. So she leaned on Bishop Meade. She leaned on her step-grandmother, Anne Hite. She talked to folks that were sort of in her inner circle and trying to figure out, how do I do this? What do I do? Luckily, at the time, her Anne Hite, her step-grandmother, and Mary's youngest sister, Anne Hay, said, we got you. We'll take care of the kids back home. It'll give you a year or two to try to figure out what you want to do. How are you going to do it? But basically, on the home front, don't worry about it. Keep doing what you're doing. So that family support back home allowed her to try to figure out what she was going to do. And it was actually her Aunt Portia Baldwin who said to Mary, why don't you bring your family over to Athens with you? At this point, her baby sister Anne didn't really have much tethering her to the States, but she wasn't living in Virginia at that point. I think she'd moved to Missouri, but either way, she was widowed. Her son was young. And so Mary thought about it. By this point, Mary was a seasoned missionary in Athens. She knew the community well. She knew the people, the culture, the needs, and the deficiencies. And because of this knowledge, she was able to identify a need to start another boarding school for girls, but that one that wouldn't just cater to lower class families. It would also accommodate middle and upper class families as well. It would be almost exactly like the school she was a part of with the Hills. It would just be for not just low income students. And she thought, I think I can make this work. So that's what she did. She ended up taking her inheritance and starting this boarding school. And she was able to bring her sister Anne over, her nephew John Hay, and her orphan niece Edmonia, who was young. She was a baby at the time too. So they all moved to Athens, Greece to live with Mary. They opened their own school. They were able to live on their own. So they had this independence, which was what Mary was really hoping. She was able to strike that balance, which was pretty incredible for the time for her to do this as an unmarried woman. And believe it or not, the two sisters continued to run their new boarding school until 1866. So for about 13 years, they ran it until the Cretan Revolt started in 1866. Sorry, I forgot to click. Make sure I'll give you a minute to read this. This is just the timeline of when Anne came to, her youngest sister went to Athens, and or when she lost her husband, and then they moved to Athens. A lot of folks thought that Mary was a part of the Crimean War, but she was actually a part of the Cretan Revolt, which was took place over about 3 years. As I did in Athens, I'll set the stage for Crete in 1866. It was a small island population of about 200,000 people, of which about 50 to 60,000 were Turkish, and the rest were Grecian. While it was technically a Grecian island, Turkey controlled it. A lot of the Greek Christians were forced to convert to the Muslim faith, which is modern-day Islam, as a means to survive the brutal Turkish rule. Cretans, along with the support of Grecians, ended up rising up against Turkey, and they got partial freedom, not full freedom, but partial freedom. It was a very tumultuous time, and as a result of it, there was an influx of Cretan refugees to Greece, which is where Mary comes into the picture. Right before the revolt, Mary was actually thinking about coming home to Virginia. She just wanted a break. She'd been teaching a long time. She'd been away from home for a long time, and she thought, I need a break. And but then the refugees started coming in, and she was like, message received, I'm going to stay here in Athens. I obviously am needed more here in Athens than I am back in Virginia. During this time, she wrote to her family and friends asking for money, basically to try to help support these refugees who were now under her care. She was feeding them and caring for them and educating them. As she did previously, she was teaching these refugees how to sew and knit. She was teaching them how to a skill that would again help them with their independence. So the funds that she received, she actually used to employ a lot of these refugees. So they would earn their money, but then they would also sew and knit garments that could then be distributed to the refugees. So it was a pretty beautiful system, a beautiful way to use the money she received. And within just a few months, the refugees had actually made almost 3,500 garments to distribute to each other. Believe it or not, during this time, Mary actually became good friends with Florence Nightingale. Florence was in Greece helping nurse the sick and wounded, and she heard about Mary. Mary's reputation kind of preceded her. The two met, they hit it off, and they became lifelong friends. They were really two peas in a pod. They both grew up in very affluent families. They didn't really want for much, but they also knew that traditional domestic life wasn't for them. They weren't feeling fulfilled. Florence decided to become a nurse while Mary became a teacher. They both received a good bit of pushback and criticism for their profession, what they decided to do with their life, but they both had conviction and they were like, no, this is what we're going to do. Like, get on board or don't, it's up to you. But they had a shared love of and devotion to humanitarian work, and it really did bond them in friendship long after the revolt had ended. We do have on the exhibit, I grabbed this snapshot, which is a letter that Florence wrote to Mary, but I do encourage you to go read the letters that Florence wrote to her. You could really sense the admiration that Florence had for Mary, and that no doubt Mary had for Florence. It's definitely worth a read. In 1867, in the middle of the revolt, Mary's youngest sister Anne decided to move to Syria, Joppa, Syria, to live with her, which is now Tel Aviv, Israel. She wanted to live with her son, John, who by this point was a young man, and he was the vice consul, the US vice consul. Together, Anne and John started a boarding school in Syria for poor boys, much the same way Mary had done for the poor girls in Athens. Once the Cretans started to go home in 1869, Mary was left wanting to go and be with her family in Syria. She had been serving in Athens for 33 years, and she thought it was time for a change, and she missed her family. So she actually requested a transfer, and once it was approved, she headed to Syria in 1869. In Syria, she and Anne lived in a place called Palm Cottage, which was in an American colony along the ocean. When she first arrived, she actually worked with a Scottish woman named Miss Arnott to establish a girls' boarding school. It's kind of what she became known for. She had decades of experience. It was a pretty natural transition for her. But by this point, Mary was getting a little bit older. She had temporarily lost her eyesight. Once she regained her eyesight, she decided to go and work with John, her nephew, and her sister Anne at their all-boys school, which was called the Joppa Mission School. This is actually a drawing of the Joppa Mission School, some of the instructors and the students. Shortly after she got to Syria, even though she'd been helping at the all-girls school, her nephew had to go to Jerusalem for work, and it left the Joppa Mission School unattended and abandoned. And they didn't have the money to keep it going. But Mary and Anne decided to move the school to their home, and they actually ran it out of Palm Cottage. So they were able to reopen it fairly quickly, within a few months after they had to temporarily close it. And within just a few weeks of reopening, they went from 13 students to 40. And their students were a pretty diverse group. They had boys that came from Muslim, Greek, Syrian, Roman, Syrian, Protestant, and Jewish households. And the reason I mention that is because I think the diversity gets to another characteristic that really stands out of Mary's. She welcomed everyone. If you wanted to learn, she was there to teach you, regardless of your religious background. Of course, she would teach the gospel. She was a Christian woman, but she believed in teaching it in the native tongue. Whatever the student's native tongue is, she believed very firmly in trying to teach them in their own language so that they could truly understand what they were learning and not just nod their head out of insecurity. She wanted to make sure they were really understanding it. She needed more money, though. And so she had her 50-pound salary, which wasn't much. She'd pretty much depleted her personal funds, her inheritance during the Cretan Revolt. So she headed back to America to try to do some fundraising. This image here is a part of her passport application from 1873. The full one is online if you want to look at it. Right after she got home to the States, she actually had a fall coming out of church and she fractured her thigh. And I only bring this up because she ultimately became lame as she got older. This injury haunted her until her death. And she talked about it a good bit in her letters, but she was never one to throw herself a pity party. And I throw these little things out because I think it's really important to understand who she was as a woman. And we have so many letters that it's really, you can kind of get that insight from those personal letters. And I'm going to paraphrase as living in 2022, but in a nutshell, she'd be like, I'm in a lot of pain. I had to use a crutch, but it's a beautiful day to be alive. Like, she just never dwelled on the pain. She was always sunny side of the street. So after her time in America, just within a few months, she was able to raise about $2,000, at which point she headed back to Syria in December of 1873. During this time, she kept in touch with the donors back home. And a lot of times a lot of the churches wanted to know, where did our money go? Who are we supporting? Can you tell us about the student that we're helping? And in her letter, she would often say, we appreciate your donations. Thank you for your generosity. It didn't go to just one student. It went to the whole school. We're using it across the boards. But Mary also understood that the folks back home wanted a personal connection to the people that they were helping. So she would often pick out a student and profile them and allow the church to sort of bond with this one student throughout their time at the school. So this excerpt here is actually taken from a letter that Mary wrote in September of 1875. And I picked it because, as she did in Athens with the girls, teaching them how to become seamstresses, she taught the boy students, her male students, how to become carpenters. So she was teaching them gospel, she was teaching them how to read and write, but she was also teaching them a trade so that they too could become independent. By 1877, her health was deteriorating quickly, and her doctor actually wanted her to go to England to regain her strength, but she never made it. She never made it there. She ultimately died at 66 years old on June 20th, 1877. The photographs you see here are of Mary's sister, Anne Hay. She's in the lower corner, and her niece, or her cousin rather, Jacqueline Davison, is in the upper corner. These women tried to keep the Joppa Mission School going. They actually renamed it the Mary Baldwin Memorial School. But the Foreign Committee, which was the organization that basically controlled the funds for mission work, refused to fund the school any longer after Mary died. So the two women tried to fundraise much the same way Mary did, but they just weren't able to raise sufficient funds to keep the school going. So they did ultimately have to close it. In the end, Mary is accredited with founding female education in Greece, and she paved the way for other female missionaries to travel abroad. Part of what made Mary so progressive for her time was her non-discriminatory approach to her mission work. She took in everyone and wanted to help as many underserved, underprivileged people as she possibly could. Her devotion to her faith and her students touched so many throughout her life, and she left behind a very admirable legacy. As with our Anne Hite exhibit, we do have 3 learning activities that we tried to tie into Mary's story. The first is be your own botanist. Mary collected plants while she lived in Athens. She collected various plants, herbs, and flowers, and she pressed them in between passages from the Bible. And she actually sent this herbarium book to her step-grandmother, Anne Hite. And we have the whole thing digitized. So if you go to the exhibit, you're able to engage with each page in the herbarium book. And there's a Zoom feature, so you can really kind of really engage with it. So I do encourage, and we do have steps for you to create your own herbarium book if you want to. So you can both look at it and create your own. One of my former colleagues at George Mason University worked with the Chappell Manuscript Foundation to create a lesson plan for 11th grade US history students and or 12th grade US government students. And the goal is to allow students to explore American tourism to the Holy Land in the late 1800s, including why and how people would travel to the Holy Land at this time. The lesson plan is really thorough, very well thought out. So if you're a teacher on the call, or if you know anybody who's a teacher, I do hope that I hope you'll look at it, because it's a really well done lesson plan. And the book that you see here, The Mission Life in Greece and Palestine, this is sort of the primary source that drives Mary's narrative. It was written by a woman named Emma Pittman. It's not an autobiography, but it's almost semi-autobiographical in that Emma was a good friend of Mary's, and they wrote it together while Mary was still alive. And then Emma completed it after Mary died. So there's a lot of input from Mary in this book. So it's a really rich source. And it's in the public domain. It's actually on Google Reads. And if you go to the exhibit, I have the link so that you can engage with the book, without having to buy it. And then our last activity is transcribing historical handwriting. Mary was an avid letter writer, and we're fortunate to have 30 pages of these handwritten letters that we actually got from the University of Virginia libraries. So the Smithsonian has a really robust transcription project going. And so I linked to a lot of the resources through the Smithsonian on how do you even get started doing transcription of historical handwriting, because it may not be intuitive to everybody. So we're hoping that folks will help us transcribe these letters so that we can have a more robust collection of primary sources from Mary that we can actually understand and share with folks. Thank you for attending. I'm happy to answer any questions. Again, I have a little consulting business. I'm happy to help anybody. If there's any historians on the call that would have any interest in doing exhibits like this, please do reach out. And if there aren't any questions, I'm happy to go to the exhibit itself and just sort of show you the layout of it. It's entirely up to you all.
Well, before you do, and I would like to see that, thank you so much.
Sure.
This was absolutely lovely and brought back a lot of things that I too have been reading about. And I guess maybe one comment that I would like to make, for me, she really was an important part of the suffragette movement that was going on in the United States at the time. She was one of the first ones, even though hers was religiously based. It was still a wonderful example of a woman not only going off on her own, but actually running the schools, actually being in charge. And this, made a great difference on what was going on with, the suffragettes. If you look up what we think of as the typical suffragettes, this was going on at the same time. So she really was a part of that, which meant a lot to me when I first started reading about her. I knew her religious impetus that was behind it. But as I read more and more, she really was a vital part of making people aware that a woman not only could be independent, but could actually be in charge, and run a business, which that's what she was doing really when she was running the school. So this is wonderful information that reinforces what I've read too. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. No, it's a great point. There was one letter, and I pulled a quote out from it. It was when she was trying to get money back home and she was receiving pushback. Somebody somewhere was giving her flack, and she didn't get testy much in her letter. She always had a level of decorum, but there was definitely a palpable sternness when she was writing them back. And she was, again, I'm going to paraphrase, but the gist of it was, a man will take a chance to raise money, like to make money. Why can't I take a chance to try to start a school? Like, what's the difference? And of course the difference was she was a woman, right?
Yeah.
But it's a beautiful quote. I put it at the very end. I didn't have a home for it, but it was too good to not include. So I put it at the end of the exhibit. Yeah. She was ahead of her time. She really was.
Oh yes, absolutely. And coming out of there at Belgrove, and she grew up at Belgrove, where, the old traditions were being held on to as long as possible.
Yeah. So someone asked during the research, what surprised you the most? There was a woman who traveled to Syria in the 1860s, I want to say, and she met Mary and Anne, and she thought that they were actually from New England because they had this stoicism to them, and she was really surprised to learn that they were actually wealthy white women from Virginia, not just from the States, but like really from the South at the time. Not that we're not still Southern today, but especially in 1860s. And one of the things that I have, anytime you do historical research, you have these pictures of people in your head. And I think that it speaks to perhaps how her time overseas might have hardened her a bit. I think her heart was always in the right place, and she did benevolent work until the day she died. But I think that her stern exterior, I think she probably had to get that way. And I think that it was telling that somebody mistook her for being from New England because she was so stoic. It's surprising, but it was insightful too, because most of the letters were from Mary, written to other people. So to have somebody's opinion on the outside, and they were still very kind and hospitable, but definitely not like over the top, mushy, flowery people. Should I go to the exhibit if there aren't any other questions, and I can just sort of show you the rundown?
Yes, I would like.
Sound okay?
If no objections, yes.
Yeah. If there's anybody who would help us transcribe, we really are hoping to get that up off the ground. It would be, we would love the help, and it's fun to engage with primary sources. So this is the landing page of her exhibit, and I talked about a good bit of it, but of course I didn't want to totally repeat everything that's in here. If you come to the landing page, I did create a timeline because there was so much going on. So on the landing page, there is a timeline that kind of takes you through some key moments in her life. And I talked a good bit about her early life and her life in Athens. And there are more primary sources embedded in each of these pages. So if you have time to explore, you should be able to dig a little deeper. The one thing I didn't talk about was this holiday in Italy. Mary ended up taking a vacation, and she needed one after a few years of being in Athens, and she ended up going to Italy. And again, she wrote about it pretty thoroughly. And so on this page, I just let Mary tell us the story of her trip. So I didn't really do much narration. I let her tell us the stories because she went to all of these landmarks that we still know to this day. And so I let her describe them in her own words. And again, you're very much, in this particular instance, you're reminded that she truly was a student through and through. She learned everywhere she went. But even here, even when she was in Italy, she would go to churches and religious institutions that weren't necessarily Christian, but she just wanted to learn. And again, she was just very open-minded, which was another thing that did stand out to me during the research, which I mentioned. But it was surprising to have a woman be overseas doing mission work, but be so open to other cultures and other religious backgrounds. And then her life in Joppa, Syria, and then her death and legacy. And then here is where I have random quotes that I couldn't leave out. So I put them as memorable quotes because they were too good to just live in my notebook. So I put them here, and I sort of did subcategories. And if you go to the main menu, I also have, I can take you to, oh, Jessica, that's not what I wanted to do. Under the learning activities, there's her herbarium book that I was telling you about. So that's all here. And if you scroll over, you're able to sort of have them zoom so you can kind of get up close and personal with each page in the book. And then with the letter transcription, this is nothing fancy. I'm hoping it works and it gets off the ground. Again, these are the resources from the Smithsonian. And then we have, again, a Zoom feature where you're able to zoom in on her letters. And then each page, each Word doc has its own Google Doc. So you would just have to sign into Google and transcribe as you go. Hopefully. We're hoping maybe down the road to have a more sophisticated tool, but for right now, this will get the job done, hopefully. Are there any other questions? No. Wonderful. Again, I really appreciate you all dialing in, and I welcome any feedback. I know Kristen does too. Again, we're hoping to add more to this site, but for right now we have another exhibit on Anne Tunstall, Mari Hite, and then Mary. So we've got these two profiles of these women that were a part of Belgrove's history. And again, there's educational resources on both exhibits. So if you know educators, home educators, or educators across the board, I do hope you'll share the site with them. Wonderful.